Creekside Youth, what up? It's your boy back again, another soul study. I think we're on like our 9th or 10th soul study now here, so that's pretty cool, other than the fact that we've been doing this all of quarantine, and that is a long time, so that part sucks. We're talking about what it looks like to have a healthy soul, how your soul has some needs, 4 main needs that we see in the garden in Genesis when God creates this perfect environment for humankind to live. So we've got these 4 needs that we extract from that your soul needs to be healthy, and we're looking to implement those needs in our lives emotionally, physically, and spiritually so that we can have healthier souls in this season of life where so many things that are normal for us have been stripped away, so it's so easy to be unhealthy in our souls, and we're looking to be healthy. Right now we're looking at the topic of restraint. We've talked about rest, and we've talked about responsibility, and now we're talking about restraint, which we get from the tree in the garden. We talked about it last week. And kind of our whole theme for restraint as we're looking at it is I can, but I shouldn't, so I won't. Your soul needs to be able to say that. And if we're being entirely honest, you believe that you are a victim to so many of your desires and so many of your wants. You really do. You believe that you're a victim to your wants and your desires. And so often you cave to them. Last week we looked at what it looks like to exercise restraint emotionally and how many of us believe that we are victim to our emotions, that we have no power when it comes to our emotions, that we have no hope when it comes to our emotions. We're just helplessly swept away by them. And we looked at what it looks like to exercise restraint emotionally. So now we're moving to what it looks like to exercise restraint physically. I want to talk to you about a lifestyle that Jesus lived, which gives us this great example of what it looks like to live in restraint physically. Jesus lives this lifestyle of what I will coin as vicious submission. He can often be, when we read his words and his actions, we can perceive Jesus to be a pansy because it seems like Jesus is just he's just a doormat, like people walk all over him, and he's very submissive in how he lives his life. But he is not submissive in a way that we would understand submission. Jesus is not submissive like somebody who doesn't know how to stick up for themselves. He is not submissive in that everybody's right and he's always wrong and he's happy to take the blame. He's not submissive like we would understand submission. Jesus is aggressively submissive. He is viciously submissive in the way that he lives his life. And there's reason and purpose to it. And we're going to look at that today so that we can look at what it looks like to live in submission, specifically in submission when it comes to injustice, okay? So vicious submission when it comes to injustice that's happening in our lives. We see the great example in Jesus' life and in his words and in his teachings. So we're going to look at that because that's what it looks like to live in restraint physically in the real world that we're living in right now. That's what it looks like to live in restraint, where we can say, I can, but I shouldn't, so I won't. So check this out. Jesus has this great teaching in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5. It's one that we're probably familiar with. He tells us that if somebody hits you, you ought to turn the other cheek. That's the famous part of this. He says, you've heard an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but if somebody hits you, turn the other cheek. But then he also continues on, this part we don't know nearly as well. He also says if somebody sues you for your coat, you should give them the rest of your clothes also. And if somebody forces you to walk a mile with them, you should walk an extra mile. So this is his saying to us, and that seems pretty counter what I just told you, that Jesus is viciously submissive. It seems like that's a pretty doormat statement, right? Like it seems like people just walk all over Jesus. Jesus is like, if somebody hits you, let them hit you again. If somebody sues you, don't fight back. Give them everything you have, actually. If somebody pushes you around and forces you to walk a mile with them, go walk another mile with them. And you're like, Jesus, that does not sound like a fun way to live life, right? Like Jesus is talking about, this is what it looks like to stand up to bullies. And he's saying, just let them hit you harder. And it's like, that sounds terrible, right? So it seems very opposite. It seems like kind of the pansy view that we have of Jesus, that he's just very mellow, relaxed, lets anybody walk all over him. So I think some context will help us understand what Jesus is doing here in his vicious submission, because Jesus's vicious submission does not come out of avoiding conflict or not wanting people to feel like they're wrong. That's not Jesus's problem. Jesus is happy to point out people who are wrong. Jesus is happy to create conflict. Jesus's vicious submission in the way that he lives his life comes out of his true belief that God will be just, that it is God's job to execute and pursue justice, and it is not his job to try to manipulate things or to give people what's theirs, but he repays injustice with vicious submission, and there's purpose to it. So check this out, a little bit of context for you. We'll take each of those three things: turn the other cheek, give them all your clothes, is not just your coat, and walk the extra mile. We'll give them a little bit of context, and you'll begin to see a pattern here. So turn the other cheek, okay? If somebody was going to hit you, that would be obviously a very degrading thing that could happen to you even today, but it was extremely disrespectful in Jesus's time. So if somebody was going to hit you, they would always hit you with their right hand, okay? This is probably looks backwards because I'm using a selfie camera, but this is my right hand. So they would hit you with their right hand. That's just how things were, because everybody, whether you were right or left-handed, used their right hand, and there's a reason for that, okay? Toilet paper is a modern invention, okay? It's not something that they had in Jesus's time. So this is serious. This is legit. This is where Bible history gets just wild and awesome. When you would go to the bathroom, when you would poop, right, in Jesus's time, you didn't have toilet paper at your disposal. They didn't have bidets, right? They didn't have anything to clean themselves. So you would wipe with your left hand. That was the cultural norm, right? So if you did anything with your left hand, you were considered gross, or a pervert would really be the more accurate kind of terminology for how people would see you if you use your left hand. If somebody went to shake hands with you and you use your left hand, gross. If you even went to grab something from somebody with your left hand, that was gross, because that was a degraded hand. That was a gross hand, right? So if somebody was going to slap you, they would obviously use their right hand, because it's the cultural norm that when you're touching somebody, when you're interacting with somebody, you only ever use your right hand, because the left hand is the gross hand, okay? This is like legit, okay? So if somebody was going to hit you, they would hit you, right? So I'll be somebody else. They would hit you with their right hand, right? Psh, they smack you. So Jesus says that he wants us to turn the other cheek, right? If you turn the other cheek after somebody with the right hand, right? Turn the other cheek. Now, this cheek is protected by your shoulder and facing away from them, and it gives them only one option, and that would be to strike you again, but this time with their left hand. And they would only do that if they were extremely frustrated with you, because they would be risking so much in how they would be perceived as a person to use their left hand in interacting with you. So what once was disrespectful to you, boom, now you turn the cheek, and if they hit you with their left hand, becomes ultimately a disrespectful thing that they have now done to you, and they are considered the pervert, the gross person, the jerk in this situation, because their injustice towards you as you turn the other cheek by your submission to them, saying, you can hit my other cheek as well. That submission actually proves, it points to, and it reveals the injustice at hand. It allows the injustice to be seen publicly and be dealt with, right? Okay, so that's the context, cultural context for turning the other cheek. Bet you never thought of that when you were reading the Bible, okay? So there's that one. Then we have, if somebody sues you for your coat, give them the rest of your clothes also. If somebody had a petty kind of frustration with you in Jesus's day, they could sue you for a piece of clothing that you were wearing. If somebody sued you for your jacket, that would be extremely disrespectful, because you would have that cloak with you wherever you would go. It wasn't really a jacket, it was more of a cloak. You'd have that cloak with you. It was a kind of normal part of like life, right? It was like how you would normally dress. You wouldn't generally be seen without it. And if you were seen without it, it was probably because you had it nearby, right? So you always have that with you. So if they sue you for your coat, then that's just this kind of like, they're stripping away something that's like normal life from you. And it's petty and it's unnecessary, but it's to bring kind of shame and dishonor on you. But then Jesus says, I don't just want you to give them your coat, give them everything else you're wearing. Strip down, give them all your clothes, right? Which is just, that's a weird teaching, right? But here's the deal. If somebody sues you for your coat and you give them your coat, right? Then you look dumb because they have taken your coat now, right? But if you strip everything else off and give it to them, well, now how do they look, right? They look like somebody who was so frustrated, so angry, and has done such an injustice against a person that they took everything that they were wearing just because of a petty frustration with you. See, it once again publicly reveals the injustice that's happening. Jesus says when somebody sues you for something that's so petty, give them your coat, but give them everything else you're wearing too, because it's revealing, it's showing the injustice at hand. And then again, if somebody forces you to walk a mile, walk an extra mile. This was a common thing that would happen at Jesus' time, where Roman soldiers would come through a town and they would put their like backpacks and stuff like that on civilians, no matter what they were doing. If you were working, they'd throw their backpack on you and say, like, walk and take my load for me, right? Take my backpack and this weight that I've been carrying. And Roman soldiers would abuse their power to have citizens walk their stuff for them, right? So that they could get a break while they were walking through town. So you'd walk through town and then generally you'd give it back to them, and they'd, kind of say something rude and demeaning to you and send you back on your way. But Jesus says, don't just walk with them through town, which is already degrading, right? You're having to like carry their backpack for them, right? Like that's like ultimate bullying. If that happened at school, that would suck, right? So you're having to carry their backpack for them through town. Everybody's seeing you. It's humiliating. Jesus says, don't just walk through town because they're using their power for injustice. Instead, walk an extra mile past town. Be further inconvenienced by this already terrible thing that they've done to you. And what would happen is if a commanding officer or a general found out that they had abused their power to that extent, not only just through town, but then for an extra mile, he would beat those soldiers for being lazy, because it reveals the great injustice. So here's the theme all throughout, is that Jesus is not calling us to a life of vicious submission because he wants us to be doormats, because he wants people to be able to walk all over us. Jesus calls us to, and he doesn't just call us to, but he lived himself a life of submission up to the point of death, that when false accusations were brought against him, when they brought people to lie in their testimonies against him, that he just remained silent, right? Like this is a life that Jesus lived, and he's calling us into that same life to trust that God is just, that he will take care of injustices, and instead when you further submit to injustice, it actually reveals and exposes the injustice. So when injustice happens to you, when you feel like something your parents are making you do isn't right, when you feel like you have too many chores, right? And they make you take out the trash too much or whatever, right? You feel like injustice is happening there. When you feel like your siblings have done an injustice to you, your friends, your teachers, fill in the blank, right? The way to make them seem right for the injustice that they have done against you, the best thing that you could do is to act out, right? Is to say, I'm going to show you, because you've done this injustice against me, I'm going to act out against you. I'm going to combat the injustice. I'm going to take it on. I'm going to find justice for the injustice that has been done to me, right? You can do that. You can seek justice for the injustice. You can try to take justice yourself and pull it by the reins and say, I'm going to do what I want, and I'm going to get what I want out of this situation, and it will only reveal them. People will be like, I don't know, maybe they were kind of right for what they did to you, because you seem nuts right now, right? Or on the other hand, you can further submit. You can further submit to the injustice. If you feel like taking out the trash after dinner is unjust, you can do the dishes too. If you feel like what your sibling did to you, the way that they talked to you, was unjust, if you felt like they did something intentionally to try and provoke you, you can let them take it a step further. If you felt like your friends did something that was backstabbing to you, you can help them backstab you again, right? It further reveals the injustice. It doesn't make you a doormat. It shows that you trust that God is the one who pursues justice. God is the one. You can pursue justice on your own. You can try to take it for yourself. But you can, and you shouldn't, so you won't. right? The way to live in restraint in this world is to live in this life of vicious submission that Jesus models for us. It's a wild concept, but I think that kind of restraint in your life will add a lot of benefit. I love you guys so much. Hope this leads to a great discussion.